How can you give critical feedback without it feeling mean? This video, I'll talk about tips to do just that. When you're a manager and having to give feedback for someone, that can be one of the hardest things that you do. Because those may be people that have been your friends, you may have good relationships with them, or you may flat out not know how to say something. And that's where being a manager really is a skill in learning and practicing. But backing up, no matter what industry you're in, what kind of role, remembering as a manager that your job is to help your team do their jobs as best they can. That includes helping them learn, develop, and grow. And when they're not doing something, either as expected or as they should, it's understanding what's happened. Did they have the training they needed? What are resources? Really getting to the root cause. So starting out as a manager, one thing you can think about is, what would I want to have happen if this were me or someone I loved and someone wasn't doing a good job at work? Like they literally weren't meeting expectations. There's some places where that can be a bit more obvious of what that means when you have to give critical feedback. Like in sales, if they're not hitting sales goals. It can be harder if it's things like the way they write, the way they talk, things like that can feel squishy or a little harder to give feedback on. But if objectively, in your heart of hearts, you're knowing this person's not doing what's expected, it can be a really natural instinct to kind of kick the can down the road and really soften it a bit. But thinking about threading that needle, being clear, but also treating them as a human, it can again helpful to think about from the perspective of you or someone you care about. So that can help because sometimes that person that may have that performance may be someone you've never got on the right foot for, or you may be thinking about other things, like they don't know what they're doing there and making all these assumptions and they're this, they're that. But so thinking about that of, if I weren't doing well or someone I love, how would I want that conversation to go? And it probably has a lot more questions than it does with statements. That can be helpful before the performance review. When you see someone's not performing, that's when the opportunity is to talk about it. Because the first time you see someone not doing what's expected, they probably don't need something like a formal performance plan. It's probably not too late to make a change, but thinking about what kind of resource they can have. And then as it goes on, if you're at a formal performance review and you're having to give someone a rating, it can feel a lot harder. And that's where it's important to think about what conversations you can have before that review, so it's not a surprise. But talking really specifically about what's happened. And this can be one where language really matters. Because going into a performance review, you may think, well, they know they're not doing a good job. But they may not. So making those assumptions can do more harm than good. So thinking about what are questions that I can ask them, have those conversations in advance to make sure that I understand what's been happening, what kind of training and support, and what they really understand about that role and the goals. But in it, some of the language as well is thinking about, it can feel really personal to get negative performance feedback. Someone telling you you're not doing a good job. People can hear, and sometimes managers can even say things about them personally. Like, you're a poor performer. You're a poor performer. So those generalizations can really hurt and also put someone on defensive. So they may not be able to even hear that feedback. So instead of saying things like you are, talk about what happened, like their performance. Okay, this number right now, the revenue is at X, it's in sales, we'd expect it to be here. What's the disconnect? Let's go into things like the activity levels and all of that, of what they're expected to do. Because just like poor performance can often show in those results, as a person, they're going to have to talk about what they've done, and you're going to have to explain the decisions that they can make to hopefully improve that performance. Other things, like I said, the squishier topics, like emails, communications. Again, instead of saying like, you're a communicator, no one understands what you're saying when you talk to them, those type of generalizations can be really hard. It can be really hard to hear and really hear and be able to hear anything else in the conversation. So instead of the you are, thinking about, okay, this communication, like let's take a look at it and read how this might read to someone that had no background whatsoever. And it can be helpful to then explain, because that person may read it and think, okay, now I get it, but having them read that a second time. And so talking about different strategies that they can do, whether it is printing it out and reading it, or whether it's having someone else, like a peer that you can look at and glance at things. As a manager, this is where your support can be really helpful. But so overall, for these reviews, it is important to really articulate where they are against expectations. And really, ideally, before this performance review, you've talked about what the root causes are for those. And then talking about what that plan is. because a performance review isn't just a blip in time. It's ongoing expectations. So ultimately, someone may have questions like, am I going to get fired? And so talking specifically about what those are. And sometimes managers will think, oh, well, this isn't clearly the job for them. But thinking about how you ask that with care. And it may not be in the performance review that that's the right opportunity to have that conversation, because there certainly are going to be times a role or an organization isn't a fit. But thinking about as part of your follow-up plan, so that it's not just the performance review and then you move on with life and expect that employee to do everything on their own. As a manager, it can be having those conversations, meeting with them, and having that plan for what that looks like. If it's in sales, activity levels, if it is communication, okay, send things to me. I can give you some feedback. Are there resources or courses that you can do to help them learn about, ways to communicate? And if your organization has a budget, that can be terrific. If not, there's plenty of free resources. But ultimately, just like I started this video with this idea of what are things that you'd want to hear, is you'd likely want to hear not just where your performance is against the organization's expectations, but also things that maybe you haven't heard in your whole career, but people just haven't told you. So thinking about how to say that, to someone, like, we're not just here to get work done. As a manager, I want to help you. And if there's feedback, I'm sure it can be hard to hear if you haven't heard it before, but I also want to support you in your career. And so some of the things that you can do, resources, support, that can help you develop even more in this area that I think will be helpful for you in this job and the rest of your career. So showing them that. And the last is that follow-up plan, because you likely would also want to say, okay, what's next? People want that clarity. And what are things that I can do to improve my performance? Because there may be times after that the person thinks between the formal performance review and the next conversation and comes back and says, okay, maybe this role isn't for me. But asking the questions as a manager, you have someone that's in role. And especially as a manager, you may think when someone's not performing, like, write them off, they're never going to perform. There's plenty of times, there's been a lot of resources likely spent recruiting that person to be there. And so as long as they have that will, they want to do things that can help them improve, thinking specifically about what types of, again, tasks, training, shadowing, they shadow you, you shadow them, then shadow others, all the development things that you can do to really help that team member. So that performance review, that hard review, or that hard feedback, that can be a development experience that does go on to help them in their career. My last closing point is that's something you can say. If it's a hard conversation to have, I often tell people, be candid about that. Saying, it's hard to have the conversation because, whether I like you, you're a team member. But I do think it's important to hear areas where that can be improved, that can help you in this role and your career.